Seven ice demons and famine stalking in the shadows. Ada felt the ground tremble, not from the biting wind of 70 below, but from the roar that tore through the blizzard. The blade in her hand felt heavy, weighing as much as the last hope of her people. With her heart hammering against her ribs, she watched the colossal silhouettes materialize from the whiteness, each bearing horns that looked like spears and carrying the weight of 1,000 mountains. The ice beneath her mucklucks creaked, an ominous lament, as the elder huntress prepared for the impossible. Ada needed only one, but the herd surrounded her, and the frozen abyss opened its jaws, threatening to swallow everything. She knew every step was a risk to her life, but what she couldn't predict was that the true enemy wasn't the giant beasts, but the frozen earth itself, about to give way beneath her feet. The frigid air burned her lungs with every breath, but Ada ignored the pain. Her eyes, accustomed to the white vastness of the Alaskan interior, locked onto the largest of the bison, a titan weighing over 5,000 pounds. With a thick coat and horns that looked like crowns of ice. He was the key to her village's survival, yet also the greatest danger. The elder felt the vibration of the ice beneath her feet, an omen her ancestors had taught her to respect. It wasn't just the weight of the animals that threatened them, it was the fragility of the surface itself, corroded by underground currents and the relentless force of the blizzard. With the cunning of a fox and the patience of a hibernating bear, Ada began to move. There was no room for error. She used the wind to her favor, the glacial howl masking the sound of her cautious steps. Her gestures were minimal, almost imperceptible, a silent dance between life and death. She observed the herd's pattern, looking for a gap, an opportunity. The bison, though cornered, were powerful and unpredictable, their red eyes reflecting the fury of hunger and fear. One false move, and she would be crushed, not only by the animals, but by the very mountain of ice that would disintegrate upon impact. Ada waited. Hours dragged on, each minute a century of cold and tension. Her gloved fingers could barely feel the bow, but her mind was as sharp as the blade she carried. Finally, the largest bison, perhaps driven by a primitive instinct for dominance or sheer impatience, took a step forward, distancing himself slightly from the group. It was time. With the precision of one who had lived a lifetime of hunting, Ada loosed an arrow, not to wound, but to direct. The arrow whizzed past, grazing the animal's flank, which reacted with a furious bellow, separating further from the herd. The ice, already under extreme pressure, groaned. Thin fissures, like spiderwebs, began to spread from the area where the colossal bison moved. Ada knew she had little time. The beast, now isolated and enraged, charged at her, horns low, eyes shining with determination. But Ada did not retreat. Her feet were planted firm, her heart, despite her age, beating with the strength of a warrior. She raised the blade, its sharp point catching the little light of the pale day. The bison lunged, the frozen earth shaking under the impact of its hooves. Ada, with a movement that defied her years, dodged, pivoting with the agility of a wind spirit. In the exact instant the giant passed, she drove her blade home with all the strength she had left. It was not a blow of anger, but of necessity, of a deep love for her people. The animal stumbled, a deep groan escaping its throat. In that same instant, a deafening crack tore through the air. The ice beneath the colossal weight of the bison and the force of its fall fractured violently. Deep rifts, like open scars on the face of the earth, began to spread in all directions, swallowing the snow and the silence. Ada felt the floor drop out beneath her feet. She lunged forward, a last and desperate effort, clinging to an exposed rocky ledge, while the bison, now lifeless, sank into the icy depths, taking a vast portion of the surface with it. The elder hung precariously, the black and freezing abyss opening below her. Her fingers screamed in pain, but she could not let go. The meat vital to her people was down there, and she, Ada, still needed to emerge victorious. Ada hung there. The cold, once an external enemy, was now a torment penetrating her bones, amplified by the searing pain in her fingers and shoulders. The abyss below seemed to suck in all light, a pit of darkness and ice promising a frigid end. The sound of cracking ice still echoed in her ears, a cruel reminder of life's fragility out here. Her eyes, however, did not linger on the threat, but sought the bison, the promise of life for her people. He was there, caught on a ledge further down, a silenced colossus, yet still immense, inaccessible. With a suppressed groan, Ada began to move. Every muscle seemed to protest, every joint creaked with age and effort. She was no longer the agile young huntress, but the wisdom of her ancestors ran in her veins, guiding her calloused hands. Slowly, inch by inch, she sought purchase in the tiny crevices of the exposed rock. With every movement, the surrounding ice seemed to whisper, threatening to give way again. Her face, weathered by wind and time, was set in a mask of pure determination, thin lips pressed tight. She pulled, pushed, her feet seeking the smallest foothold, her ragged breathing turning into small clouds of steam in the gelid air. The thought of her grandchildren, with their hungry eyes, was the fuel burning in her chest. The image of her village, silenced by starvation, was a burden heavier than the bison itself. She could not fail. She would not fail. After what seemed like hours, with the skin of her hands raw and arms trembling from exhaustion, Ada managed to reach a stable edge. She dragged herself up, her heavy body collapsing onto the snow, the air escaping her lungs in a hoarse sigh. For a moment, she closed her eyes, feeling the pulse throb in her temples, her heart beating wildly, a melody of relief and pain. But there was no time for rest. The bison lay a few yards below, on an unstable ice shelf. It was a sight of both victory and despair. How to drag that mountain of meat out of the abyss? Her eyes scanned the ravine, searching for a solution. She noticed a wider fissure, a spot where the ice seemed to have stabilized somewhat, and above it a rocky protrusion that could serve as leverage. Blade still in hand, Ada descended again, with redoubled caution. The smell of fresh blood mixed with the pure, freezing air. She knew she had to act fast before other predators were drawn in, or the cold froze the meat to the point of being unmanageable. The task of dismantling the giant was Herculean, but she had done it hundreds of times. Every cut was precise, guided by a lifetime of experience, by wisdom passed down through generations. She worked with a cold efficiency, separating the larger, most vital cuts with a strength that seemed to come from elsewhere, from a reserve of energy only despair and love could summon. Sweat ran down her forehead, freezing into small pearls of ice. Her muscles screamed, but she continued, her mind focused on the task, on the future of her people. She used pieces of the animal's own hide, cut into sturdy strips, to tie the heaviest parts of the meat. With a monumental effort, she began to pull, using the rocky protrusion as a fulcrum, her feet digging into the snow for traction. Every piece was a triumph. Every inch dragged out of the abyss was a promise kept. The sight of the vital meat, now on the safe surface, brought a wave of relief and a pang of pride that warmed her chest. Ada sat in the snow, exhausted, body aching, but heart light. The pale sun of the interior began to set, painting the sky in shades of reddish purple, a spectacle of wild and pitiless beauty. She looked at the meat, piled in the snow, and at the abyss, now a silent tomb for the rest of the bison. The victory was hers, but the way back was long and dangerous, and the merciless cold awaited. She knew the true journey was just beginning, but with the vital meat in her hands, hope had returned to the territory, a flickering beacon in the imminent darkness. She felt the weight of responsibility, but also the unshakable strength of her spirit, a silent testament to human resilience. The sun, a mere whisper of light on the frozen horizon, plunged the territory into an even colder embrace. Ada felt the weight of exhaustion in every fiber of her being, but the sight of the meat piled in the snow was a balm for her weary soul. There was no time for luxuries like prolonged rest. Her fingers, swollen and numb, could barely close into a fist, but she knew she needed to start the return before total darkness and the even more brutal temperatures of the night swallowed her. With a sigh that turned into dense vapor, she stood up, her stiff spine protesting every movement. The problem now was transport. The bison, even in parts, was a mountain of meat. Her small sled, which she used for the journey out, would never support such a load. Her eyes scanned the terrain, seeking inspiration in the unforgiving landscape. The wisdom of her ancestors, whispered on cold nights around the fire, came to mind. She remembered how the old hunters improvised. Using her blade, Ada began to cut thick, tough strips from the bison's hide, the same hide that had once protected it from the cold. With them, and with strong, dry branches she managed to dig out from the shallower snow, she began to build a rudimentary sled. Her movements were slow but precise, every knot tightened with the strength of necessity. As she worked, Ada's mind traveled to the village. She could almost smell the smoke of the lodge fires, hear the voices of her grandchildren, little Koda with his curious and always hungry eyes, and sweet Lena, who dreamed of becoming a huntress like her. The image of them, with faces gaunt from scarcity, was a whip to her will. She wasn't just dragging meat, she was dragging hope, life, the future of her people. A solitary tear rolled down her wrinkled cheek, freezing before it reached her chin, a silent testament to her love and sacrifice. Finally, the improvised sled was ready. It was crude, but looked sturdy. With superhuman effort, Ada began to load the pieces of meat, organizing them carefully to balance the weight. Each piece was a challenge, a test of her waning strength. She felt the pain in her shoulders, the muscles of her back in every joint. The cold penetrated her gloves, and her fingers felt like chunks of ice. But she went on, pulling the leather straps that served as a harness, feeling the colossal weight of the sled slide with difficulty through the deep snow. The journey back was even more treacherous than the way out. The snow, once a relatively firm surface, now seemed to have become softer and deeper with the wind, making every step a battle. The rugged terrain, the small rises and depressions turned the act of pulling the sled into constant torture. The wind, which had earlier helped mask her movements, now howled in her ears, bringing sharp snowflakes that stung her exposed skin. Darkness enveloped the world, and the stars, shining with a cruel intensity in the clear sky, offered little light to guide her steps. Ada moved like a ghost in the white immensity, her silhouette bent against the dark horizon. She stopped every few yards, panting, heart beating like a war drum in her chest. Her eyes, however, remained fixed on an invisible point ahead, the way home. She knew the night would be long, perhaps the longest of her life. But the warmth of hope, the promise of seeing her grandchildren's smiles, was a fire that burned inside her, defying the 70 below cold. She was not just an elder huntress. She was the beating heart of her village, a guardian of life, and she would continue to pull one step at a time until the morning light revealed the safe path back home. The night advanced, each minute extending its icy mantle over the white vastness. Ada, a diminutive figure against the immensity, pulled the improvised sled, feeling the weight of the vital meat and the hope of her village in every fiber of her being. The wind, now stronger and merciless, whipped her face, transforming snowflakes into ice needles that pricked her exposed skin. Her eyes, previously fixed on an imaginary point, now struggled to distinguish shapes in the almost total darkness, guided only by memory and an ancestral intuition. Every step was a battle. The snow, which before was just an obstacle, had become a trap, giving way under her feet and hindering the sled's progress. The dry branches that formed the frame creaked and groaned, threatening to give way at any moment, a sound that mixed with the wind's howl and the erratic beating of her own heart. The pain in her shoulders and back was a constant companion, a presence that intensified with every pull, every effort to move the colossal load. She felt her muscles trembling, exhaustion infiltrating her bones, whispering promises of rest and surrender. But Ada could not yield. The image of Koda with his small cold hands and Lena with her hopeful gaze was a shield against despair. She could almost hear her grandchildren's stomachs growling, could feel the silent worry of the village elders, the anguish of mothers watching their children waste away. It wasn't just a hunt, it was an oath, a promise that life would continue, even in the coldest heart of the world. Her lips, chapped and dry, murmured ancient prayers, words of strength and resilience echoing through generations. Suddenly, the sled stopped abruptly. One of the branches had caught on a hidden ice ridge beneath the snow. Ada pulled harder, but the sled remained motionless. A wave of frustration and despair threatened to swallow her. Her fingers, already numb, slipped from the leather straps. She clenched her fists, feeling the anger and fatigue fighting within her. It was not the time to falter. With a muffled cry carried away by the wind, she turned, kneeling in the snow to disengage the obstacle. Her movements were slow, every touch on the frozen wood a stab of pain, but she persisted. Finally, with a dry snap, the sled broke free. Ada stood up, panting, body bent with pain, but determination shining in her eyes. She leaned into the leather straps, pulling again, one step at a time. With every advance, however small, a tiny flame of hope lit up in her chest, warming her from the inside out. She wasn't just dragging meat, she was dragging human resilience itself, the capacity to overcome the impossible. The night was still long and dark, but Ada, the elder huntress, would continue her journey. A beacon of courage in the icy wilderness, heading toward the promise of a new dawn for her people. Ada continued to pull, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. The sled, loaded with the promise of life, seemed to weigh more with every meter traveled. Darkness was nearly absolute now, only distant stars dotting the sky like cold diamonds, offering a faint light that barely revealed the contours of the landscape. The wind, her constant and cruel companion, now seemed to have gained a new fury, howling like a starving wolf and kicking up clouds of snow that blinded her eyes and cut her skin, making her press her cracked lips together. Her feet, despite layers of fur and felt, were numb, and she barely felt the ground beneath her muklux. The snow, once a treacherous surface, had turned into a frozen swamp where every step sank deep, demanding redoubled effort to break free and advance. The sled, with its branches creaking and groaning, bogged down repeatedly, and Ada had to stop, breathe deep, and pull with all the strength remaining, arms shaking and shoulders burning with lancinating pain that seemed to penetrate right to the bone. The image of Koda, her youngest grandson, with his rosy cheeks and toothless smile, danced in her mind, warming her inside. And Lena, the eldest, with the seriousness of a young woman waiting at the lodge entrance, eyes full of worry, a burden and a motivation. They were the reason for her struggle, the fire keeping her spirit lit against the paralyzing cold. She wasn't just a huntress, she was a grandmother, a matriarch, the pillar of a family and a village that depended entirely on her courage and sacrifice. Suddenly, a different sound mixed with the wind's howl, a dry, alarming crack. One of the sled's branches, already weakened by the colossal weight and constant friction with the ice, had snapped. The sled tipped to one side, spilling a considerable chunk of meat into the deep snow. A groan of despair escaped Ada's lips, a hoarse sound lost in the immensity. Frustration, mixed with the exhaustion weighing on her, threatened to crush her. She knelt in the snow, aching fingers feeling the broken branch, sensing the cold, brittle wood. There was no way to fix it there, in the darkness and biting cold that hardened everything. Her heart tightened in her chest. With every minute lost, the risk increased exponentially. Other predators, drawn by the scent of fresh blood, could emerge from the shadows, or the meat could freeze further, making it impossible to handle and divide. But Ada was not one to quit. With a mind sharpened by necessity, she began to improvise. Using the leather straps she still had, and with the help of a piece of sharpened bone from the bison itself she had kept as a precaution, she managed to tie the remaining meat pieces more compactly, distributing the weight differently, though the sled was now visibly compromised and unbalanced. She would have to drag part of the meat directly, without the sled's support. With a heavy sigh, she stood up, the pain in her back intensifying with every movement. She grabbed one of the heaviest cuts of meat, tying it with a leather strap and dragging it alongside her while pulling the sled with the other hand. It was a doubled effort, an ordeal that seemed endless. But with every step, however slow and painful, she felt the strength of her ancestors in her veins, the resilience of a people who had survived countless winters, a legacy of strength transmitted through time. Ada looked to the sky, where the aurora borealis began to dance in shades of green and blue, a spectacle of ethereal beauty that seemed to mock her earthly struggle. But for her, it wasn't mockery, but a sign that even in the deepest darkness, beauty and hope could arise. She would continue to pull, to drag, to fight, because life in the territory was a constant dance between death and persistence. And Ada, the elder huntress, was determined to dance until dawn, promising a future for her people. Suddenly, her eyes, nearly closed from exhaustion, caught a dark, elongated silhouette, half submerged in the snow a few yards ahead. Her heart skipped a beat. Was it a predator lurking in the dark? She stopped, body tense, blade in hand, breath suspended in the gelid air. The northern lights, which had danced softly before, now seemed to pulse with greater intensity, illuminating the mysterious shape. It wasn't an animal, it was a sled, an ancient sled, made of dark wood worn by time, but surprisingly intact in its main structure. It was half buried, as if abandoned decades ago, perhaps centuries, swallowed by snow and forgetfulness. A wave of emotions hit her. Surprise, a pang of sadness for the hunter who left it behind, and a spark of hope that lit up in her chest, warming her from the inside out. It was larger and sturdier than her improvised sled, with runners of polished bone that promised a smoother glide over the snow. Ada approached with caution, gloved fingers feeling the cold wood. She felt the rough texture, the marks of a life of use, of other hands that once guided it through these same frozen landscapes. It was a gift from the ancestors, a tangible connection to the past, proof she wasn't alone in her fight. With renewed strength, she began to dig it out, using her hands and blade to remove the packed snow. Every movement was an effort, but the promise of more efficient transport drove her. The wood creaked as she freed it from the earth's icy embrace. Finally, the sled was free. With a sigh of relief, Ada began to transfer the meat piece by piece, from her broken sled to the new, sturdier one. The weight was still colossal, but the solid structure of the ancestral sled offered stability she didn't have before. She tied the meat down with leather straps, ensuring nothing would be lost. The pain was still there, but now accompanied by fierce determination and deep gratitude. The path was still long, but the darkness of the night no longer seemed so insurmountable. With the ancestral sled ahead, Ada felt she carried not just the meat, but also the spirit of every hunter who came before her, guiding her home. Ada took a deep breath, the frigid air burning her lungs, but a new energy, a spark of hope, ignited in her chest. The ancestral sled, now loaded with the promise of life, glided with a smoothness her own improvised sled could never achieve. The polished bone runners cut through the deep snow with less resistance, and the weight, though still colossal, seemed more manageable. She leaned forward, pulling the leather straps with renewed determination, feeling the steady rhythm of the sled under her calloused hands. The pain in her shoulders and back was still an uncomfortable presence, a constant reminder of the ordeal she had endured. Her muscles trembled with effort, and her feet remained numb, but Ada's mind was clearer, focused. She was no longer fighting the inefficiency of precarious transport. She was moving with the wisdom of her forebears, carrying a legacy of survival, stretching back countless winters. Every advance, however small, was a triumph, a step closer to home. The wind continued to howl, but now seemed less an enemy and more a silent companion, pushing her lightly from behind. The aurora borealis, which before danced like a distant omen, now stretched across much of the sky, a shimmering river of green and blue illuminating the landscape with ghostly, ethereal light. Ada raised her eyes, a small, tired but genuine smile breaking on her cracked lips. It was as if the spirits of her ancestors were watching and approving of her journey, guiding her through the deepest darkness. She thought of Coda, the little one dreaming of fresh meat and warmth, and of Lena, the young woman waiting with a tight heart and eyes full of worry. The image of them, faces lit by the village fire, was the force driving her. It wasn't just meat she was dragging, it was the future, the continuity of her village, the flame of life refusing to be extinguished by the pitiless Alaskan winter. She felt the connection to every hunter who, before her, had faced the same vastness, the same hunger, the same unshakable hope. The night seemed to begin to yield. On the eastern horizon, a faint band of grey began to mix with the deep blue of the sky, a harbinger of coming light and the promise of a new day. The cold, though still intense, seemed less biting, or perhaps it was the warmth of hope heating her inside, an inextinguishable fire. Ada knew there was still a long way to go, but the landscape, once a canvas of impenetrable darkness, now began to reveal its contours, its subtler rises and dips. She stopped for a moment, bending over the sled, hands resting on the cold, ancient wood. Her eyes swept the white immensity, seeking a landmark, a familiar sign to reassure her. And there it was, distant, almost invisible in the dissipating gloom, the unmistakable silhouette of a mountain marking the edge of her hunting grounds, a marker signifying she was on the right path, closer to home. A wave of relief washed over her, mixed with the exhaustion threatening to knock her down at any moment. With a renewed sigh, she straightened her body, feeling every bone protest with almost palpable intensity. The journey was a test of her unshakable will, of her deep faith in her people's capacity. But she was not alone. She carried with her the ancestral wisdom of generations, the intrinsic strength of a people who refused to be broken by nature's rigor. The ancestral sled was more than simple transport. It was a powerful symbol, a tangible link to the past, driving her tirelessly toward the future. Ada, the elder huntress, would continue to pull one step at a time until the morning sun kissed her tired face and led her back to the welcoming arms of her village, to the life she had fought so bravely to preserve. The faint band of grey on the eastern horizon expanded slowly, painting the sky with soft shades of pink and orange mixing with the deep blue of the departing night. The aurora, though still visible, began to fade, like a dream dissolving at dawn, leaving behind only the memory of its ethereal beauty. The cold, which before seemed a relentless enemy, now presented itself with a more bearable intensity, perhaps due to the promise of approaching light, or perhaps the stubborn warmth of hope burning in Ada's chest. The ancestral sled, an unexpected gift from the past, continued to glide with remarkable efficiency, its bone runners cutting the snow with a soft sound, almost a whisper. Ada felt the still colossal weight of the meat, but the sled's solid structure distributed it in a way that spared her already depleted strength. She pulled the leather straps with gloved hands, fingers still numb, but mind focused on the road ahead. Every muscle in her body ached, an orchestra of silent protests she had learned to ignore. Her knees, punished by years of hunting and age, creaked with every step, and a sharp pang in her lower back reminded her of the fall in the ravine. But she did not stop. Her eyes, once fixed on darkness, could now distinguish the landscape's contours more clearly. Snow-covered trees, looking like white ghosts in the twilight. The gentle rises of the terrain and deeper depressions. The mountain, previously just a distant silhouette, now revealed itself in greater detail, its rocky, ice-covered slopes serving as a lighthouse for her journey. A sense of familiarity, a silent comfort, invaded her heart. She was on the right track, closer to home than ever. The image of Koda, the youngest grandson, with his curious eyes and toothless smile, rose in her mind, warming her like a campfire. She could almost feel the touch of his small, cold hands, the expectation in his gaze. And Lena, the eldest, with the seriousness of a young woman who was surely awake, watching the horizon, waiting for her grandmother. The responsibility of being the matriarch, the huntress, the pillar of her family and village, was a heavy burden, but also the source of her inexhaustible strength. She wasn't just a woman pulling a sled. She was the incarnation of her people's resilience, the promise that life would go on, even against the most brutal adversities. Suddenly, a subtle sound, almost inaudible, broke the silence of the birthing morning. A crack. Ada stopped abruptly, body tense, eyes scanning the landscape. It wasn't the ice cracking nor the howl of a predator. It was the sound of a small fracture in the ancestral sled's wood near one of the bone runners. A fine fissure, almost invisible, but opening slowly under the weight of the meat and constant friction. A shiver of apprehension ran down her spine. The sled, her gift from the ancestors, her last thread of hope, was threatened. If it gave way now, all her effort, all her pain, might have been in vain. Her cracked lips pressed into a thin line, and a deep furrow appeared between her eyebrows. Exhaustion threatened to swallow her, whispering of the futility of her struggle. But then Ada closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deep, feeling the gelid air fill her lungs and the smell of snow and meat. She opened her eyes again, and in them there was no longer despair, but an even fiercer determination. The crack was an obstacle, yes, but not the end. She had faced colossal bison and treacherous ice. A crack in the wood would not stop her. With a nod, as if answering an invisible challenge, Ada adjusted the leather straps, distributing the weight with even more caution, and with a renewed sigh continued her journey, one step at a time, toward the sun, now beginning to kiss the distant mountains. Ada adjusted the leather straps once more, feeling the cold, ancient wood of the sled graze her hands. The crack, previously a thin line of worry, now extended a little further, a silent reminder of the fragility of her hope. The sun, which moments before only kissed the distant mountains, began to climb higher on the horizon, spilling a cold, golden light over the white landscape. Each ray of sun revealed new details of the terrain, but also deepened the shadows, creating a dramatic contrast that seemed to mirror the struggle in her heart. The ancestral sled, despite its robust structure, groaned under the colossal weight of the meat and constant friction with the snow. Ada felt the vibration of the wood in her hands, and with every small jolt, the crack seemed to whisper of imminent danger. She knew she couldn't stop. Stopping meant risking the meat freezing further, or predators, now more visible in daylight, being drawn by the scent. Her eyes, accustomed to the gloom, now squinted slightly against the snow glare, but she could see the path more clearly. The mountain, marking the edge of her territory, was closer, its rocky, ice-covered slopes looking like a silent guardian. A pang of relief washed over her but was quickly replaced by urgency. Suddenly a louder crack echoed in the gelid air. Ada stopped, heart racing in her chest. A small splinter of wood detached from the side of the sled near the crack, falling into the snow with an almost inaudible sound. The fissure was now more visible, threatening to open completely. The sled tilted slightly to one side, and for an instant Ada felt icy despair rise in her throat. But she was not one to surrender. Mind sharp with need, she knelt in the snow, examining the damage. There was no time for complex repairs. She untied one of the leather straps used to secure the meat, and with agile fingers began to wrap it firmly around the damaged part of the sled, tightening it with all the strength she had left. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would buy time, stabilize the structure enough to continue. As she worked, the image of Koda, with his toothless smile, and Lena, with eyes full of worry, filled her mind. They were the reason for her persistence, the unbreakable link driving her. Hunger in the village was an enemy as ruthless as the cold, and she was the only hope. The responsibility weighed on her shoulders, but also strengthened her. With the sled minimally secured, Ada stood up, feeling the pain in her back and knees with renewed intensity. Every fiber of her body cried out for rest, but the sight of the mountain, now sharper, and the promise of a new day propelled her forward. She pulled the leather straps, feeling the sled move again, a little more stable, a little more reliable. The sun was already high enough to minimally warm the snow's surface, and the first stronger rays began to kiss her tired face. Ada raised her eyes to the deep blue sky, a small smile appearing on her cracked lips. It wasn't just the sunlight warming her, but the flame of hope in her heart, the certainty that life in the territory was a constant dance between adversity and overcoming. She would continue to pull, one step at a time, carrying not just meat, but the legacy of her people, the promise of a future for her village. The road was still long, but with every step, she felt the strength of her ancestors guiding her home. Ada pulled, every fiber of her being responding to the ancestral call echoing in her blood. The sun, now higher, painted the snow with a blinding shine, transforming the landscape into a sea of glittering diamonds. The cold, though still cutting, seemed less oppressive under daylight, but exhaustion was a heavy shadow dragging beside her, threatening to swallow her with every step. Her knees protested with sharp pains, and the stab in her lower back, a constant reminder of the fall in the ravine, radiated down her legs. The ancestral sled, her unexpected gift, continued to glide, but the crack in the wood, once just a worry, now widened visibly, an open wound bleeding hope. The leather strap Ada had tied to contain it stretched and groaned under the tension, threatening to snap at any moment. With every jolt, a dry, alarming crack echoed in the silence, making the elder's heart race. She felt the wood vibrate in her hands, a vibration that seemed to communicate the sled's own fatigue, an echo of her own exhausted body. Ada stopped for a moment, bending over the ancient structure, gloved fingers feeling the crack. The snow, once an ally damping sound, now seemed to amplify every moan of the wood. There were no more spare leather straps, nor time for complex improvisation. The only option was to press on, praying the sled would hold. Her eyes swept the horizon, seeking the mountain marking the boundary of her territory. It was closer now, the imposing silhouette standing out against the pale blue sky, but still seemed an eternity away. The image of Koda with his small cold hands, and Lena, with the seriousness of a young woman, filled her mind. She could almost smell the smoke of the village fires, the promise of warmth and safety. Hunger, an invisible and ruthless enemy, awaited her arrival. She could not fail. The responsibility of being the matriarch, the huntress, the pillar of her family and village, was a burden that, paradoxically, strengthened her. It was the flame keeping her spirit lit, the reason for every painful step. With a sigh that turned to steam in the gelid air, Ada started pulling again. The sled, now more unstable, demanded redoubled concentration from her, a delicate balance between force and caution. Her feet sank into soft snow in some stretches, and the effort to lift them was excruciating. With every movement, she felt the pain intensify, but also the certainty she was on the right path. The sunlight, once a distant gleam, now kissed her tired face, warming it gently. Suddenly, the sled stopped abruptly. Ada stumbled back, nearly falling. The crack in the wood had opened even further, and one of the bone runners had partially detached, dragging in the snow and creating massive friction. A groan of frustration escaped her cracked lips. Despair threatened to dominate her, a cold wave rising in her throat. Was this the end? After everything, after fighting the colossal bison, the treacherous ice, the exhaustion consuming her, would this be what stopped her? She closed her eyes, breathing deep, feeling the frozen air fill her lungs and the smell of snow and meat. No, it would not be the end. The strength of her ancestors, the resilience of her people, would not allow it. She opened her eyes, and in them there was no longer despair, but a determination even fiercer. The village waited. Koda and Lena waited. With a mind sharpened by necessity, she knelt again, examining the damage. It was serious, but not insurmountable. She would need more than a leather strap. Ada looked around, eyes scanning the landscape for anything that could help. A young tree, perhaps? A branch strong enough to serve as a splint? The sun, now almost overhead, illuminated a small cluster of wind-twisted birch trees a little further ahead. It was a faint hope, a detour that would cost precious time, but it was the only chance. With a nod, as if answering an invisible challenge, Ada began to move toward the trees, her mind already tracing a plan, her will unshakable. The journey was a test of her faith, of her capacity to overcome the impossible. She carried not just meat, but the legacy of her people, the promise of a future for her village, and she would not yield. With every step toward the birches, she felt she was reaffirming her promise, an unbreakable link to life. Ada moved toward the twisted birches, every step a challenge to her will. The snow under her feet seemed deeper, and the effort to lift her numb legs was excruciating. The sun, now higher, cast a dazzling glare over the white vastness, but the heat was illusory, and the cold continued to bite her exposed skin and penetrate her clothes. She felt exhaustion infiltrate every cell of her body, a heavy fog threatening to obscure her mind. Her lungs burned with the frigid air, and the pain in her knees and back was a constant companion, a relentless reminder of her body's fragility. Reaching the small cluster of trees, Ada stopped, bending over, gloved hands resting on her knees, trying to catch her breath. Her eyes scanned the thin, whitish trunks, looking for a branch that might serve. The wood, frozen to the core, was hard and brittle. She needed something flexible, yet strong enough to bear the weight and tension. Her fingers, already numb, felt the lower branches, sensing the rough texture of the bark. She found a thicker branch, appearing to have been broken by a previous blizzard, but still attached to the trunk by some resilient fibers. It was long and straight enough. With a grunt of effort, Ada pulled her sharp blade from its sheath. The cold metal burned her hand through the thin glove. She began to saw and break the branch, using all the strength she had left. Every cut was a battle against the frozen wood, and her muscles trembled with effort. The sound of the branch snapping, a sharp, dry crack echoed in the silence of the landscape. Finally, with a final, desperate pull, the branch broke free, releasing a small cloud of snow dust. Ada held it, examining it with tired but determined eyes. It wasn't perfect, but it was her only hope. She dragged the branch back to the sled, lying tilted in the snow, the loose bone runner hanging precariously. The crack in the sled's wood seemed to have widened even more with the movement. Carefully, Ada knelt again, the pain in her knees almost unbearable. She positioned the newly acquired branch along the crack, using it as an improvised splint. The problem was how to secure it. There were no more spare leather straps. Her eyes swept the sled, looking for a solution. It was then she remembered the small leather pouch she used to keep her medicinal herbs and a few charms. Inside it, there was a piece of dried caribou sinew, strong and flexible, which she kept for emergencies. With trembling fingers, Ada untied the pouch and removed the sinew. It was a precious material, but the situation was critical. With surprising speed for her age and exhaustion, she began to wrap the sinew firmly around the branch and the damaged part of the sled, tightening it with all her strength. Every knot was an act of faith, a silent prayer to the ancestors. The sinew, once moistened by saliva to make it pliable, hardened quickly in the cold, creating a surprisingly robust binding. The sled still groaned, but the crack was contained, and the bone runner, though not perfectly aligned, was more secure. Ada stood up, feeling every bone protest, but a warmth of triumph, mixed with pain, spread through her chest. She had faced the impossible once again. The image of Koda and Lena, their faces anxious and hopeful, was the force driving her. She could almost smell the smoke of the village fires, the warmth of community. Hunger would not win. With a renewed sigh, Ada adjusted the leather straps over her shoulders. The sun, now almost at its peak, illuminated the mountain ahead, which seemed almost within reach. The path was still long, but the sled, though wounded, was moving again, gliding through the snow with a steadier rhythm. Ada pulled, one step at a time, carrying not just meat, but the legacy of her people, the promise of a future she had fought so bravely to preserve. Ada pulled, every muscle in her body crying for rest, but her will was iron. The sun, now at the highest point in the sky, cast an intense shine on the snow, blinding her at times, but she didn't look away from the horizon. The mountain, once a distant beacon, now rose majestic, its rocky, ice-covered slopes revealing familiar details. The rock formation that looked like an ancient face, the cleft where the frozen river snaked through. She was home. The smell of smoke, faint at first but unmistakable, reached her nostrils. It was the smell of the village, of the fires warding off the cold, of the life she had protected. A shiver, not of cold, but of emotion, ran down her spine. Her feet, despite being numb, found a painful rhythm in the snow. The sled, though patched, still groaned and creaked, but the caribou sinew binding held firm. Every crack was a reminder of the fragility of her journey and her tenacity. The image of Koda, with his curious eyes and toothless smile, and Lena, with the seriousness of a young woman, filled her mind. She could almost hear their voices and feel the warmth of their hugs. They were the melody driving her, the promise of a future. Suddenly, a dark speck appeared on the horizon, growing rapidly. It wasn't a mirage. It was the first lodges of the village, small and humble, but full of life. A cry of triumph and relief escaped her cracked lips, lost in the silence of the territory. She quickened her pace, pain forgotten for an instant, heart beating strong in her chest, and then she saw them. Small figures running toward her like colored dots in the whiteness. Koda and Lena were in front, their thin, joyful voices echoing in the frozen air, calling her name. Ada, Nana Ada. Tears, long held back, ran down her weathered face, freezing into trails of ice. She dropped the sled straps, letting it glide the last few yards, and opened her arms. Koda was the first to reach her, small arms wrapping around her legs, face cold against her clothes. Lena came next, eyes watering, a smile of relief lighting her face. "You came back, Nana. You did it," Lena said, voice choked. Ada bent down, hugging both grandchildren with all the strength she had left, feeling the heat of their bodies, the familiar smell of home, an embrace containing pain, struggle, and hope. The other villagers approached, faces previously tense now relaxing into smiles of gratitude and awe. The men pulled the sled toward the village, eyes fixed on the colossal meat that meant salvation. The women, with tears, touched Ada's hand, expressing gratitude in whispers. The elder huntress, wounded and exhausted but victorious, personified the resilience of her people. Later, with the meat distributed and fires crackling stronger, Ada sat near the fire. Koda nestled in her lap and Lena by her side, small hands holding hers. The warmth of the fire and familial love enveloped her, healing invisible wounds. Hunger would be kept at bay, life would go on, testament to the courage of a heart that challenged nature's giants of the cold. The village was safe, and Ada, the elder huntress, could finally rest, her heart overflowing with deep and deserved peace. The village was safe, and Ada, the elder huntress, could finally rest, her heart overflowing with deep and deserved peace. The warmth of the fire, crackling happily in the center of the main lodge, didn't just ward off the cutting cold of the territory, but also seemed to warm every fiber of her being, dissolving the exhaustion that had accompanied her for so many days. Koda, with his small, soft head nestled in her lap, slept a peaceful sleep, lips parted in a slight smile. Lena, sitting beside her, held her wrinkled hand, young and wise eyes fixed on the dancing flames, but a gleam of relief and admiration dancing in her gaze. Ada's scars, both the visible ones on her face and hands and the invisible ones on her soul, were silent witnesses to an epic journey. The smell of roasting meat, rich and juicy, filled the air, mixing with the aroma of smoke and herbs. Outside the lodge, the sounds of the village were of renewed life, muffled laughter, the babble of children, the clinking of utensils as women prepared the first plentiful meal in weeks. Hunger, that relentless and silent enemy, had been driven away. The meat of the colossal bison, sliced and distributed with reverence, would feed everyone, ensuring the winter could be faced with dignity and hope. Ada watched Koda, feeling the boy's soft breathing against her thigh. He was the future, the reason for her struggle. Lena squeezed her hand, and Ada turned to her granddaughter, a small smile appearing on her lips. "We did it, my little one," Ada whispered, voice hoarse with fatigue, but full of deep emotion. Lena nodded, eyes watering with unshed tears. "You are the strongest of us all, Nana," she replied, voice choked with pride. Ada closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of those words. It wasn't about brute strength, she thought, but the strength of spirit, the stubbornness of a heart, refusing to yield. She had faced the paralyzing cold, the fury of the bison, the betrayal of the ice, and the fragility of the ancestral sled. Every obstacle, every pain, had been overcome by the certainty that her village depended on her, the connection to her ancestors. The wisdom guiding her and the love for her family and people were the true drawn bows that propelled her. Later, as the village gathered for the meal, Ada sat among her own, watching faces lit by firelight. The elders told stories of past winters, but with a new tone of hope. The young looked at Ada with silent admiration, their eyes promising the legacy of resilience would be carried forward. She was more than a huntress. She was a living symbol of the human capacity to defy the impossible, to find light in the deepest darkness. Ada raised her eyes to the lodge roof, where smoke spiraled up, meeting the starry Alaskan sky. Winter was still long, and new challenges would arise. But the village had proven its strength, its unity. That colossal bison wasn't just meat. It was proof that courage, selflessness, and human connection could transform nature's cruelest giants of the cold into a source of life. With Coda still asleep in her lap and Lena's hand in hers, Ada felt a peace going beyond physical rest. It was the peace of knowing she had kept her promise, the peace of a heart that, though tired, overflowed with silent, deep joy, ready to face whatever came, together with her people. Life in the territory was a song of resilience, and Ada had sung the most beautiful verse. Life in the territory was a song of resilience, and Ada had sung the most beautiful verse. The following dawn brought a different quiet to the village, not the silence of hunger, but a deep peace, woven with the warmth of fires and the hum of grateful voices. Ada woke on the bed of furs, body aching, but soul light. Coda and Lena slept beside her, childish faces illuminated. She watched them, heart overflowing with love. The bison meat, cured and stored, was more than food. It was the promise that winter would be overcome, that life would continue, strong and unshakable. Stepping out of the lodge, Ada felt the frigid air, but the sun was already breaking, painting the sky. The men of the village were active, repairing sleds, sharpening tools, voices full of new vigor. The women prepared tea and porridge, the comforting aroma spreading. No one spoke of hunger, but gratitude was palpable in every look and gesture. Ada walked to the central fire, where the elders gathered. They greeted her with nods. She sat, feeling the heat warm her bones. Silas, one of the elders, handed her tea. "You brought the light back to us, Ada," he said, voice hoarse but sincere. Ada just smiled, a tired gesture, but her eyes shone with satisfaction. She sought no praise, only the certainty of having done her duty. Lena, now awake, sat near her grandmother, watching the villagers. "Nana, how did you know you would make it?" the girl asked, curious. Ada stroked her granddaughter's hair. "It's not about knowing we'll make it, my little one. It's about not giving up, even when the ice cracks beneath your feet. It's about remembering you aren't alone, that the strength of everyone who came before you runs in your veins." Coda, having joined them, climbed into his grandmother's lap. "And if the ice cracks again, Nana?" he asked, innocent eyes fixed on her. Ada hugged the boy. "Then we will find a new way across, my little one. Together." Life in the territory teaches us that every winter brings challenges, but also to find spring, even under the thickest snow. True strength isn't in never falling, but in rising every time the ground gives way. She looked at Lena, a gleam of wisdom in her eyes. The greatest hunt isn't for the bison, but for hope, compassion, and unity. Those are the giants of the cold that really matter, and that we can defeat with the warmth of our hearts. The village, now vibrant with renewed energy, was a living testament to her courage. Children played in the snow, laughter echoing. The young, inspired by Ada's feat, planned expeditions full of confidence. The elder watched it all, feeling the deep connection uniting her people. She had brought not just food, but a renewal of faith, irrefutable proof that resilience was a living force in every heart. The legacy she carried wasn't a burden, but a lit torch, passing from generation to generation. Life in the territory would continue its relentless dance. But now the village knew it had the melody and the strength to dance with it. Ada closed her eyes, feeling the sun warm her skin, and a smile of peace spread. She had sung her verse, and the song of life echoed stronger than ever.